All right, today we're going to dive into a really tough but super important moment in American history, the Indian Removal Act. This is a story about a massive collision of cultures, a huge fight over land, and a government policy that led to a forced migration and, honestly, an incredible tragedy. So let's get into it.
To really get what this whole conflict was about, you just have to look at these two maps. On the left, that's the best land in the country for growing cotton, which at the time was like oil is today. It was everything. And on the right, that's the homeland of major Native American nations. And here's the problem. It's the exact same land. This territory was the key to unbelievable wealth for white settlers, but it was already home to tens of thousands of people who had lived there for generations.
So back in the early 1800s, you've got these two powerful forces basically on a collision course. You have the expanding United States, and you have these established Native American societies who had called the Southeast home forever. Something had to give.
So why was this land so valuable? Well, it came down to two huge reasons. First, King Cotton. That soil was perfect for it, and growing cotton back then meant getting rich, period. And then, as if that wasn't enough, in 1829 they discovered gold in Georgia, right smack in the middle of Cherokee land. Suddenly, the pressure from settlers to get their hands on this land just went through the roof.
Now, it is so important to understand who was living here. We're talking about groups like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and others. White Americans called them the Five Civilized Tribes, and they did that because these nations had adopted a lot of American customs. They weren't just wandering hunters, they had farms, they had their own written languages. The Cherokee even created their own government with a written constitution, just like the United States. They were trying to assimilate, to fit in, and become part of this new American society.
So, how did the U.S. government decide to handle this? Well, President Andrew Jackson stepped in, and he came up with a federal policy that he presented as this really generous, kind solution to the whole problem.
And this was the result, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, here's a really key detail. The law didn't actually order the army to just go in and remove everybody. What it did was give the president the power to negotiate treaties, to basically offer a trade, Native American land in the east for new land out west, in what is now Oklahoma.
And here's how Jackson sold it to the public. He said the policy was not only liberal, but generous. He framed it as an act of kindness, claiming it would save Native Americans from the bad influences of white society and give them a fresh start. He even said that any white American would be thrilled to get an offer this good.
Yeah, well, the Cherokee Nation did not see it that way at all. But their response wasn't violent. Instead, they did something really clever. They decided to fight back using America's own playbook against it. Its words, its treaties, and its laws.
So the Cherokee built their case on three main points. First, they pulled out the receipts. They pointed to all the treaties the U.S. government had already signed, promising to protect their land forever. Second, they said, hey, these treaties are working. Our people are happy and prosperous. And third, instead of going to war, they put their faith in the American legal system. They sued.
And you can just see the difference in opinion right here. While Jackson's calling his policy generous, the Cherokee leadership is calling the new treaties a complete fraud. They said these deals are signed by a small handful of people who had no authority to speak for everyone else, and that the vast majority of Cherokee people were dead set against leaving their homes.
This whole legal fight didn't just stay in some local court. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that set up this epic showdown between the President of the United States and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
And believe it or not, the Cherokee won. In this huge case, Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court sided with them. The court said the Cherokee Nation was its own community and that Georgia's laws had no power there. But this is the moment everything changes. President Jackson basically just ignored the ruling. He flat out refused to enforce what the court said. And this is the famous line he supposedly said. He was basically taunting the Chief Justice, John Marshall, saying, "You've made your decision, now let's see you try and enforce it." Jackson knew the court didn't have an army. He did.
So, with the president ignoring the Supreme Court and refusing to listen to the Cherokee, the U.S. Army was sent in to force the removal. And what happened next was an absolute humanitarian disaster. It would become known as the Trail of Tears.
4,000. Just let that number sink in. That's the estimated number of Cherokee men, women, and children who died on this forced march. Out of about 16,500 people, roughly 1 out of every 4 died from disease, from starvation, or from the brutal cold. It's just an unimaginable loss.
And just look at this map. We're not talking about a short trip. People were forced to walk hundreds and hundreds of miles, a lot of times in the dead of winter, with almost no preparation. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough shelter, they didn't have enough blankets.
This gut-wrenching description comes from an American soldier named John Burnett, someone who was actually there. He wrote about seeing people arrested and dragged from their homes at bayonet point, and then loaded into wagons like cattle or sheep. His words just paint this brutal, awful picture of what was really happening on the ground, a million miles away from the generous policy Jackson was talking about.
And this right here, this shows the trade they were forced to make. On one side, you have their green, fertile homelands in Georgia. On the other, the much drier, unfamiliar plains of so-called Indian Territory. The Cherokee had been saying from the very beginning that this new land wasn't good for farming, that it didn't have enough wood or water for them to survive.
So, this brings us to our last question. Just think about it. As a farmer, someone who depends on the land to live, where would you rather be? This removal wasn't just about moving. It was about forcing people to trade a homeland they knew and loved for a place many of them believed was impossible to live on. It really makes you think about what was truly lost and what was gained in this tragic chapter of American history.